Hello. Today I want to talk about forest harvesting. So, in my past videos about forestry, I kind of talked about why you might harvest and the economic drivers behind harvesting. But today I actually want to talk about what forest harvesting looks like and why you might see very different types of harvesting in different places. Now, real quick disclaimer, I'm not a forester. I'm not a certified forester. I'm a remote sensing scientist. I have a PhD in that, but I sat through a couple forestry courses. Taking advice from me is like taking medical advice from ChatGPT. It's a bad idea. So I thought I would start with kind of the most aggressive types of forest interventions and then work my way back to the subtlest types of forestry interventions that you might see. And when I say interventions, I mean cutting down trees. So obviously, if we're going to start with the most aggressive type of intervention, we're going to start with clear cutting. You see, as a forest grows older, it slows down in growth. It loses vitality. It doesn't replenish itself like it used to. Eventually, you just have to give up and admit that it's time for a clear cut.
Clear cuts. Now, before we get into clear cutting, I do want to make a very important distinction here, because clear cutting is not the same as deforestation, and yet people kind of associate the two in their mind. Deforestation is what happens when you cut down usually old growth rainforest and then convert it to a cattle pasture. And obviously you are clear cutting the rainforest when you do that. But the types of clear cuts that you see as a silvicultural technique in Oregon are completely different. What you're seeing in Oregon is a forest that was maybe planted 40 years ago that has now reached a mature state and is ready to be harvested and replanted again in kind of a continuous cycle. So it's completely different as a kind of a tool. Now, why do we clear cut? The reason that you will typically see some types of forest harvesting here or other types of forest harvesting there is that forest harvesting is done in a way in which new trees can regrow in kind of a sustainable manner. So again, why do we clear cut? The answer is because most of the trees that we're managing in those types of forests have evolved to grow back in full sunlight. So you will see clear cuts in Oregon because they are managing for, Douglas fir or ponderosa pine or something like that, and those trees have evolved to grow back in fully cleared areas. Now, this is usually the case with conifers, which is to say needle-bearing trees. Now, especially on the West Coast, but in most cases with conifers, they are evolved to grow back in full sunlight because their forests are kind of dictated by fires. So a very common, thing that happens in Oregon, obviously, is that the forests catch fire, they burn, maybe they burn everything up, and you end up with a circumstance where everything is, toast, and it's full sunlight, and then new trees regenerate from themselves. So the reason you see clear cutting on the West Coast of the United States is that those forests are evolved to grow up in a situation, in which it's essentially, nature has essentially cleared all the trees already. Now, to be clear, these trees need full sunlight. I mean, they do best when they have full sunlight. And so the rationale for clear cutting is often kind of it's kind of the healthiest thing you could do. Now, let's maybe take a tour of the world. Where is clear cutting kind of right for forestry? Again, it tends to be where conifer forestry dominates. So that's the West Coast of the United States, West Coast of Canada, Douglas fir, ponderosa pine, redwoods, etc. It's maybe the Southeast United States where they do a lot of pine silviculture, so loblolly pine, longleaf pine in the Southeast United States. Mexico has a lot of pine silviculture. There's plenty of places in the tropics that also grow pines on a fairly regular basis. Scotland, you see a lot of Sitka spruce and Norway spruce being planted in Scotland and clear cut. And then the far north too. There's a lot of areas up in the northern latitudes of Canada where they're dominated by kind of black spruce. And again, it's kind of a fire-dominated regime. So the important point is that when you do clear cutting, you also follow that up with replanting. And that is obviously the big difference between deforestation and clear cutting as a silvicultural approach. So the way that it typically works is you clear cut an area, you replant it with little seedlings with probably the same trees that you just cleared. You probably follow it up with some herbicide, and that herbicide is targeted specifically to kill the vegetation that's competing with the trees that you just planted and not kill the trees you just planted. So we can actually kind of target the herbicides towards different species. Then you let the trees grow. Typically, you might do between 1 and 3 thinnings between now and the end. And then when the time comes, be it 40, 50 years from now, you clear cut the whole thing and start the process anew. And, we've been doing this in some places for a very long time. So what are the pros and cons to clear cutting? Like I said, the pro is that it's very effective and it's very efficient, and these forests are kind of evolved to grow back in this type of circumstance. It's relatively sustainable, so you can continue to do this over and over again, and you can continue to farm these trees as you would any other crop. And it's easy and it's cheap. You'd only have to go into the forest kind of once or a handful of times. Every time you go in, you take out like a good amount of wood. So, it kind of makes operations a little bit easier, and that is fairly important, especially on the west coast of the United States, where we deal with very steep topography. But, there are some cons to clear cutting as a silvicultural approach, and I would say the biggest con is the aesthetics. People hate seeing clear cuts. They associate it with deforestation. They associate it with the types of horrible degradation that was happening in the 1980s, where people were like cutting down old growth forests in Oregon. They really don't like seeing, denuded landscapes, and it gives the whole timber industry kind of a bad rep to some extent. Another kind of con could be nutrient loads. Now, this is still kind of contentious science, but especially on the west coast of the US and Canada, where, slopes are very steep, clear cutting and then repeating this cycle over and over again over the course of a century could be kind of degrading our soil quality each time, because when you have a clear-cut slope, then obviously water can just, wash away the soil. And this would probably happen less if it were an actual fire that had, kind of burned these trees. So that's a potential problem. And then biodiversity is another con. If you've got a forest that is essentially planting the same tree, it's all the same age, it goes on for an entire mile or something, you've got very little biodiversity in this forest. Now, people will be quick to point out that there are many species of animals, some of which are quite rare, that do depend on clear cuts. And I'll give you one example. In Maine, where clear cutting is against the law, there are species of animals that, basically have evolved to grow up in clear cuts. And hare is one example, the bunnies. They love really young forests that have recently been cleared, and there's tons of stuff for them to browse on and feed on. And likewise, their major predator, lynx, which is a fairly threatened species, is also, obviously tied to clear cuts. And so when Maine banned clear cuts and, essentially outlawed them, the populations of those two species decreased. And that was potentially problematic. So people will jump to say clear cutting doesn't necessarily mean that you don't have biodiversity, but it's definitely fair to say that there's more biodiversity in a forest that is kind of consistently mature and uneven aged and not the same tree planted over and over again for a full mile. Okay, so the last point that I want to make is probably a contentious one among foresters. And it's a hotly debated question right now, which is clear cutting strictly necessary in all cases? And I would say that, it gets very political in answering this, because you do have scientists doing very good science on both sides of this equation. You have scientists saying, on the one hand, these trees only grow back in full sunlight. You really need to be doing this and replicating what happens during a fire. And then you also have scientists saying, well, you don't need to be doing this. You can leave some trees, and fires are, a big driver of regeneration in the area, but maybe not like the only driver of regeneration. So I would say that there have been like some relatively recent decent studies that have shown that rather than clear cutting, you can do what's called a retention harvest, where you essentially leave trees behind. And I would say that there's been some evidence that shows that you can leave, up to 30% of the trees on a forest behind without really negatively affecting the regeneration, the regrowth of the forest into the future, especially if you leave them in kind of patched clumps. And, even beyond 30%, if you do leave, more than 30% in place, There's been some science that shows you do take a hit on the regeneration that's growing back. It doesn't grow back as fast. You will suffer some mortality from the trees that you replant, but at the same time, maybe it's kind of worth it. Maybe the forest will grow back a little bit slower, but at the same time, you'll end up with a more biodiverse system, and it's probably better for the carbon in the long term. So I would say one thing that would be really cool is if carbon credits could be used to kind of push some of the West Coast clear-cut silviculture that we have today into retention harvests. I don't know of any carbon project that's actually doing that right now. Most of the time they're working on getting people to extend their rotations or do fire management or something like that. But I think it's a plausible, good way of using the tool of carbon. All right, so we covered clear cuts. Now let's kind of move down the kind of spectrum of intensity in terms of forest harvesting and talk next about shelter woods. Now, what shelter woods are good for is when you have a situation in which you have trees that you're trying to grow back that don't grow back in full sunlight. And that describes a lot of trees in the East Coast, maybe a lot of trees in the tropics, a lot of trees in Europe. Primarily, shelter woods are good for deciduous forests. So your sugar maples or, maybe your white oak. If you plant a sugar maple just out in the open sun, it would kind of suffer from overexposure to the sun, lack of water during kind of the hottest months. And so it's best to kind of have a little bit of shade. So in these types of forests, what people will do is when they harvest, they will leave behind some percentage of large trees on the site to provide partial shade and provide seed sources for a new generation of trees. So it's common to maybe leave 20 or 30% of the trees as kind of an overstory. Once the new generation of trees has established itself, then you can go back in and you can take the big trees out. And then you can kind of repeat this cycle over and over again. So, now it's important to note that shelter wood systems are still even aged. So you're still basically growing back a forest in which all the trees are the same age. Because you go in and you cut 80%, and then what comes back all comes back at once. So you still kind of have like a little bit of a lack of biodiversity there. It's not too dissimilar from a clear cut, except you're leaving a couple trees in place in the overstory. So, where is this common? It's very common on the East Coast of the United States. That's why you don't see clear cuts on the East Coast of the United States, because if you did clear cut, you would get back nothing. If you clear cut in New Jersey, all you'd get back would be blackberry bushes. You might get back little pin oaks. When you clear cut on the East Coast, what ends up coming back are kind of early successionary species that are kind of competing with the really nice big mature trees that you're looking for. Yeah, so that covers kind of shelter woods. Next along the spectrum, we get to selection harvests. Now, selection harvests are different than shelter woods in that what you're doing is you're going in and you're nipping out some portion of the trees, but probably not the majority of trees. What you're instead trying to do is kind of nip out maybe 30% at a time and create a situation where the forest is kind of constantly regenerating itself. And what this ends up creating is an uneven aged forest where you have baby trees in the same forest that you have really big trees. Now, selection harvesting isn't inherently less profitable than any other type of harvesting, because over the long term, you're still taking out all the trees that you grow. You're just taking them out in kind of smaller bunches at a time. And the important thing to do is to nip out, some little trees and some big trees as you go, rather than just always taking the biggest ones. The idea is to kind of maintain a kind of constant diameter distribution, a kind of constant distribution of little trees and big trees, and keep the forest in kind of a constantly growing and turning over state. This is the most kind of biodiverse way of managing a forest. And there are several types of selection harvesting. So the most kind of nitpicky and sustainable type is called single tree selection, where you go in and you say, okay, we're going to leave that tree, we're going to take out that one, we're going to leave that one. And that often depends on the vigor of a particular tree and where you want those trees to seed in and whatnot. And it takes a real close eye to figure out which ones you want to take out in a very good way. And then the other thing that we see sometimes is called group selection, where you might go in and you might take out like all the trees within a little area. I think a European term for this is called the Femmelschlag. Now, a European term for this is called the Femmelschlag. And the whole idea behind this is when you go in and you might remove, I don't know, 5 trees here and 5 trees there, what you're trying to do is create a forest gap that is very similar to what would have happened in nature if a big tree grew up and died and then created a gap for little trees to grow in. And kind of the best selection harvesting is done to really replicate the gap dynamics that you often see in old growth in these systems. So in the Amazon rainforest, for example, you never see the forest being completely cleared by some natural disturbance. Instead, what you see are these little gaps that are caused when a big old tree dies and little ones then come and take their place. Well, you can do the same thing with, selection harvesting. And some of the most sustainable systems that I've seen in like the Amazon rainforest, for example, do selection harvesting, and then they replant like rare and endangered species of trees in the gaps that they just created. There are some really great REDD+ projects that are doing this and at the same time preventing mass deforestation. So as you can imagine, selection harvesting is kind of the most idealized and biodiverse scenario because you have a system in which you've got all the different sizes and ages and species of trees at once in the forest. I would say if there's a downside to selection harvesting is that you tend to need to enter the forest more often. That can make it more expensive. You make less money off of each entry, I would say. And I would say that a lot of the time the goal around selection is to remove the same amount of trees as would typically die under a natural regime. So in any given forest, typically somewhere between 1% and 2% of trees will die every year. This is just the natural state of things. Just like people, trees have a lifetime. Now, as we move on, what I want to talk about next isn't so much kind of a system of kind of maintaining harvest, but just in general what people mean when they say thinning. Because thinning can be used to mean a lot of different things. Usually, one would thin a forest in order to kind of remove competition and to profit a little bit. So in the context of a clear cut, what you would want to do after you clear cut is plant trees very densely. Those trees will grow up and pretty soon they will start competing with each other. And when trees compete with each other, they slow down because they're all trying to like fight over the same set of resources. This causes the growth in a forest to actually decline. You get less wood, you get less carbon. And so it's actually beneficial to go in and remove some of those trees to free up resources for the trees that remain. So that's a common reason people thin, and people will typically thin, following a clear cut, like I said, maybe 1 or 2 times. Another reason to thin is to capture mortality. So as I was getting at before with selection harvesting, if you can go in and you can say, well, this tree is about to die. It's really mature, it's hitting the end of its lifetime. Or if you can go in and say, this tree's about to die because the one next to it is about to overtop it, then it makes sense to cut that tree out because otherwise the tree's going to die and its wood will go, back, the carbon will go back into the atmosphere and the wood won't be used. The other reason that we thin, of course, is to kind of create gap dynamics. A lot of the time, if you're trying to regenerate a forest to an old growth state, thinning is the best way of doing that. And I think a lot of the time what I've seen is conservationists kind of getting up in arms by people thinning on like places that they've tried to reforest. The reality is when you reforest, you have to plant trees very densely so that they can compete with like the other vegetation, like the blackberry bushes, and kind of fill in the whole space with tree. And it's when you do that, you create an even-aged system where not only are the trees competing with each other, but they're all the same age. And you end up with a system that isn't very biodiverse. If you then go in midway through that forest's life cycle and take out a bunch of trees in clumps, in gaps, you will kind of restart regeneration in those gaps, and you'll end up with a forest that is much more kind of biodiverse and uneven aged and much more resembling of old growth. One of the concerns I have with some carbon projects out there is that they're reforestation projects that forbid thinning. And this could be problematic because you're planting all the trees at once, they're going to grow up all at once, and then they're going to die all at once. And you may end up in a situation where the forest doesn't come back, or where the forest dramatically declines in carbon or in health 80 years down the road. I guess as another subset of thinning, people will often talk about crop tree release. Now, crop tree release is this idea that if you have a set of trees in your forest that are really, really valuable, that you really want to grow, probably for some very high-end timber product like veneer logs or something like that, you could go in and you could remove the competition just around those trees. So we've been talking about so far all the good things you can do with forest harvesting. But I do want to talk about a silvicultural practice that is bad, and that's called high grading. And what high grading is when you go into a forest and you only take out the biggest and most valuable trees over and over again. And the reason that this is really bad is if you go into a forest and only take out the 30% biggest trees, instead of taking out 30% of some of the little trees and some of the medium-sized trees and some of the big trees, what you're doing is you're removing from that forest the genetic diversity that creates really good trees. If you kill all the big trees that grew straight, the next time that you go to harvest the forest, you'll only have scrawny, squiggly trees. If you only go and remove the valuable trees, you're going to end up with nothing but worthless trees. And I say worthless both in terms of timber, but also in terms of carbon potential. You actually create like a perverse evolutionary incentive where trees are evolutionarily incentivized to grow worse. So the thing about high grading is that it often masks itself as a selection harvest. You know, people will go in and they say, oh, I'm going to take out 30% of the trees and it's a selection harvest, but really what they're doing is taking out the most valuable 30% rather than like a truly kind of randomized 30% distribution and creating a situation where their forest is going to decline in quality over time. Okay, now I would be remiss, and the salespeople at my company would be very angry with me, if I didn't talk about Renoster's own improved forest management projects. My company is developing carbon projects, and I'll add more about that in later videos. But what we're trying to do with those projects is basically create systems that have traditionally been driven by shelter wood pulp production in the Northeast right now, and kind of push them into longer-term wood products and selection harvesting. So, you know, if you may have been typically like whacking your forest every 15 years for pulp and leaving like, 20% overstory while you do it, well, probably, yeah, anyway. Now we want you to kind of wait, hold on, grow bigger trees, grow trees that are going to grow into full saw logs. And when you get there, you can then do selection harvesting. A lot more carbon is accumulated on the landscape. You get long-term wood products that also, accumulate carbon. And you probably make more money in the long run too. Everyone likes, building. So that's kind of the idea behind our program. It's a deferred harvest program where we identify people who are, typically kind of likely harvesting for pulp, and we pay them to wait. And then at the end of the contract, they have a lot more options to do more sustainable stuff. So yeah, that kind of covers the all the different types of silviculture that you'll see. Yeah, I don't know.